Hello and welcome to SAM Conversations. The focus for our discussion in this program is US policy towards AFPAC, which is the acronym for Afghanistan and Pakistan. In recent days, this subject or this region has come onto the US radar in a visible manner. We've had the US Congressional Report Service, the CRS as it is called, issuing a report about terror groups in Pakistan and in Afghanistan and what that would do to the United States in terms of its security concerns about global terror. The second is some legislation that's been introduced about Pakistan and Pakistan's support to the Taliban. And the third development, again, related to the US Congress, is the testimony by General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, where again, he has made some very significant observations about the United States and the exit from Afghanistan, which marks really the end of one chapter in terms of the global war on terror, which began in October 2001. To unpack these issues and place them in a more informed context, I'm very happy to introduce and welcome Ambassador Teresita Schaffer, better known to her friends as Tezzy Schaffer. She is considered to be the leading expert, the black belt on South Asia in the US Foreign Office. She served in all the major South Asian countries in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and she's also served as the US ambassador in Sri Lanka. I recall that I met Ambassador Teresita Schaffer in December 1990. The Cold War was still on. She was then the DAS, the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department, looking after South Asia. And I think there's a sense of deja vu because many of the issues that we are discussing or we plan to discuss in this chat were brought up then, which is about terrorism, the rise of China, what does it mean to the United States, the Indian Ocean. They really are old chestnuts in more ways than one. But Ambassador Schaffer, welcome to SAM Conversations.
Well, thank you very much, Uday, and it's lovely to see you again. And I've watched the show a number of times, and so I'm honored to be part of it. Thank you very much.
No, I'm so glad that you could, join us for this particular chat. So what I'll do, if I may, Ambassador Schaffer, I'll request you to walk us through the most recent developments, which are now at least being reported quite, I would say, visibly in the Indian media, which is the CRS report, the intelligence, the legislation that's being sought to be introduced, and General Milley's testimony. Why don't you just take it from there and then I'll, maybe ask you a couple of other questions.
Happy to do that. And my first observation is that two of these three issues have had more coverage in India than they have in the United States, which may tell you part of your answer. The Congressional Research Service is an arm of the US Congress, but it's an independent organization. A lot of the work they do is commissioned by congressional committees or by individual representatives in Congress. I don't know what the genesis of this terrorism in Pakistan report is. The report itself seems to be quite comprehensive. And in keeping with most of the CRS reports, it's soberly written. It's not written in headline catching language. I mean, that doesn't prevent it from catching headlines occasionally, but it's not
breaking news. Yes. Yes.
And one thing they do is to distinguish in these 12 groups that they name, they distinguish their primary purpose. The anti-India ones, the mainly Kashmir-oriented ones, and then there's kind of a catch-all. So I think this actually contributes to public knowledge and is therefore a good thing. The head of the South Asia division is somebody who's been in that job for a long time, Alan Kronstadt. He is a serious student of the region, and I think very highly of him. The second one is the legislation that's considered for introduction in the Senate. In the short term, you can forget about it because the Senate, the Congress is tied up in knots. It has 4 must-pass pieces of legislation, and there is disagreement within the Democratic Party on one of them, which means that basically all 4 of them are tied up. And this has to do with our rather arcane legislative rules in the Senate, and with the question of whether the Congress should take up only the infrastructure bill that has bipartisan agreement, which is a very substantial bill. It's over $1 billion, over $1 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Or whether they should hold that until there is agreement on the even larger, what we call the soft infrastructure bill, which is what the Democrats are fighting over. They've been arm wrestling for quite some number of weeks, and it's not over yet. And then in addition, there's the bill to prevent a government shutdown at midnight tonight, which I think will pass. And the bill to prevent to permit a raising of the debt ceiling, which I believe will also pass. Normally, that would have been something you didn't even question. But I'm telling you something about the very nasty political atmosphere in the United States. Then we come to General Milley and Secretary of Defense Austin's testimony. That was an important moment, and that has gotten ample coverage in the United States. General Milley is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as you said. He was actually appointed by Trump. He's a military officer, of course. He carried over into the Biden administration. He is not a flashy guy. He's a serious guy. General Austin, Secretary Austin, is a retired general, which means that, like the first of President Trump's secretaries of defense, he had to get an explicit waiver of legislation that says you can't put a retired general in that job without congressional permission, but he got it. The occasion was the decision by first the House and then the Senate to actually call a hearing on the exit from Afghanistan, which, I mean, the photographs look just as awful here as they did in India. The decision to leave Afghanistan was controversial, but it was controversial within the foreign policy establishment. I don't think it was particularly controversial in the American public. But the debate was, could it have been handled better?
True.
Now, the answer to that is almost always yes. There's always something you could have done better. Getting a little bit ahead of my story, my own view is that while there are plenty of things one could argue could have been done better, I'm not convinced that it would have made a fundamental difference.
Casey, if I can just interrupt you very briefly here, I think it's a very important observation you're making, that as far as the US exit from Afghanistan was concerned, I think most American voices are agreed that it had to be done. So in that sense, I think, there was a certain consensus, but I agree with you about post facto, every event could have been done better. I think that is a kind of thumb rule whenever you review a decision taken. But I have a specific point, which is that if you look at the CRS report, terrorist groups in Afghanistan, Pakistan receiving support from the deep state in Pakistan is not new. It's been going on for 20
years. Not at all.
So that's one.
And while the CRS told us some organized the data in ways that people probably couldn't have done
I agree. And if
themselves.
TRX is
They
doing
didn't tell us anything we didn't already know.
exactly. So, which again, if I can just go straight to the testimony of General Miley and what had been said, as far as the US military is concerned, this is the question I really wanted to pose to you. You're familiar with how much of interest this has generated in India, not now, but for the last 20 years. I mean, you will recall, we've had a number of discussions, for instance, in the India International Center that you know very well. And all the South Asian experts from the US, whether they were in the Foreign Office, US academia, the analyst community, the think tanks. For instance, I'm talking about people like George Tanham, Steve Cohen. We've all been there, discussed it. And the question that was asked then in 2001, 2002, and which is being asked now in 2021. The Pakistani deep state, the ISI, was taking the United States for a ride in terms of aid received and the way it was used. And the greatest, I think, tragic irony was that the United States was paying not just in terms of money, but lives lost. The US military, I remember when Admiral Mullen had come here once, this was the kind of issue that we discussed in a closed door session. And he was one of many senior officers in the US military who were deeply anguished. So this is what I want you to help us understand, our viewers here. This is young India. Many of them may not even remember the Cold War. But if you could help them to understand in terms of US policy towards Pakistan, Afghanistan, terrorism, and why did the US allow itself? It's not that you did not know. US intelligence, I think, had more information than most other agencies. But yet, despite Daniel Pearl, despite everything, why did the United States allow this to happen? And that's the subtext I saw in General Miley and in all the other statements from Washington, that are we going to let this happen again? Jesse?
I think the fundamental problem was that the US-Pakistan partnership focused on Afghanistan was based on the premise that US and Pakistani strategic objectives were the same. And that's simply not true. And I not only said this, but together with my late husband, said it in print 10 years ago. We published a book on how Pakistan negotiates with the United States. And that was the core of our argument, that while there was overlap between our strategic objectives, they were by no means essential, and there were some very important differences in it. So everything flows from that. The Pakistanis were following what they believed to be their interests. Now, one can argue over whether that was an accurate assessment of their interests, but they're the ones who get to decide that.
True.
And in that, they're no different from any other country. So you have Pakistan following its interests, and even when things were going pretty well from our perspective in Afghanistan, Pakistan never gave up its links with the various Taliban organizations. I hate to use the word organization because they're a much looser entity than that.
Entities would be better,
Yeah. And that, as it started to look more and more likely that at some point the United States would leave, and this goes back certainly to within the Trump administration, the Pakistanis were thinking harder about their plan B. Then you had the negotiations in Doha between the Taliban and the United States, represented by Zalmay Khalilzad. And they arrived at an agreement of sorts. From our perspective, it was a terrible agreement. But the Trump administration's decision was essentially any port in a storm.
True, true.
And the Biden administration then decided that they were going to honor that.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, that's the first of the decisions that people question. Why treat this as anything sacred? We've changed lots of Trump administration policies. We thought they were lousy policies, and the administration made changes. I think that indirectly, at least, General Milley's and Secretary Austin's testimony shed some light on that, because they concluded that if we didn't, in some sense, say we were honoring the agreement, that the Taliban was going to turn its full energies against the US forces.
Yeah.
And without using the V word, victory, they were going to get a lot more people killed.
No, absolutely. I think that part is understood and they've said this, but I want to go back to a point you made, Tezi, which is that I remember actually having a chat with your late husband, Ambassador Howard Schaffer, when the book was released. And you remember we had discussions about it here in more than one think tank. And I think your central argument, as you said this in print quite unambiguously. And 10 years ago, if I remember right, was the Obama watch.
That's right.
And what I think the point you were making was that the US interests, strategic interests, security interests in relation to Afghanistan and terrorism, clearly Pakistan was pulling in another direction, and you drew attention to that. Now, you all were not the only voices, you were not heard at that time, but I do recall that over the years, for instance, Foreign Affairs, if I remember right, it was Catherine Gannon, I think, she had an article where she made much the same point, and so did Professor Christine Fair in many of her writings about the duplicity of Pakistan and how they were supporting terror. So this is something that many people are asking in India even now, when I go to the odd discussion in think tanks and people who are looking at US policy, saying that despite very respected voices like you, I mean, Tezi Schaffer is the to-go expert on South Asia as far as the Beltway is concerned. And there were others who were cautioning and saying that, things are not going the way they should. Why is it that successive administrations chose not to acknowledge this duplicity, the fact that the US was being taken for a ride? Your soldiers were getting killed. I mean, for me, I'm a guy in uniform, which is why I'm constantly sort of astounded that why did the White House and all the advisors and the agencies allow this to happen? And this is not my voice. I've heard senior American serving officers say this to me, Tezi, but I obviously can't take names. But please, all yours.
I think there are a number of reasons for that. The first is the human reason. You have ambassadors, cabinet officers, general officers, and presidents in the United States who have had Pakistani counterparts look them in the eye and say, "We are with you." And they want to believe that. There's a story that we actually recounted in that book about a conversation between General Zia and Arnie Rafel.
Yeah.
When he was ambassador to Pakistan.
Yeah. Robin Rafel's husband, right?
Robin Rafel's husband, yes. And I've forgotten what statement he made, but it was a blatant lie. And Arnie was absolutely infuriated when he discovered this. And one of his colleagues in the embassy, who was the representative of another agency of the US government, said, "Arnie, aren't you being a little naive? He's a general. He's going to say what he thinks is going to be useful. And he's talking to you. You're outside the Pakistan system."
True.
So I think that's part of it. There's also the Pakistani side of the story. Pakistan, the narrative in Pakistan is that the US used us when it was convenient and tossed us overboard when it wasn't.
Yeah.
That's not altogether untrue. But if you are an official in the United States, if you're being assured in Pakistan by Pakistanis with all kinds of wonderful logic in what they say, that we have to be in lockstep. And if you believe that the end result, if the exit from Afghanistan has, so to speak, a happy ending, that is so much better than the alternative, then you have a hard time formulating the plan for what if that isn't working out. And to some degree, that was done. And I know the argument has also been made that the Pentagon is a building that is absolutely chock full of planners. I'm of the persuasion that planning is really useful because of what it does to your brain. Plans rarely materialize in the form in which they've been created.
True, true.
So that's the best explanation I can give you.
Anyway, as you said, that has happened now for the United States after the exit from Kabul. They are looking at a new, shall we say, policy initiative. And I thought we saw a bit of that in the joint statement in the Quad. And we also had occasion to see what Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan had said recently. He had an op-ed. He also spoke at the United Nations. And again, there is a repeat of what had been said in the past, that Pakistan has been abandoned by the United States, and their ministers, etc., have gone on record encouraging the United States to resume that kind of a relationship with Pakistan in the interest of stabilizing AfPak again. So what is your reading, with all the, experience that the United States has now accumulated, and all that's in the public domain? Much of what we were discussing was not in the public domain as recently as a few years ago. Only the experts knew it. Now, with the exit from Kabul, what is your reading of the US policy? Or do you see the United States now pivoting, as it were, towards China and the affairs of East Asia and Indo-Pacific? How do you read this?
First of all, the president who used the term pivot to Asia was Obama. And he and both of his successors have continued that, not necessarily in the same vocabulary. I think that some rather large element of that is inevitable in US foreign policy. The increase in China's power, both economic and military, means that we bump into China pretty much no matter what happens. And that that is the, in power terms, Russia is a problem, but that's more a problem of manipulation. China is more a problem of power. Pakistan, if you will, is a problem of weakness. None of them is good. So at the end of the day, the United States has to have, I think, has to try to have a relationship with Pakistan. But the situation is so different without having US forces in Afghanistan and without having Afghanistan in play. Now, Afghanistan may be back in play if we wake up one morning, as we well might, and discover that ISIS or Al-Qaeda has set up shop there in some valley that the Taliban isn't paying much attention to, or with their consent. I mean, it almost doesn't matter. But under those circumstances, the need for a cooperative policy on Afghanistan is, it seems to me, much less than it has been for most of the past 20 years.
No, that's very true. I think, the fact that the United States is not as vulnerable anymore, meaning you do not have personnel in Afghanistan.
It's not as vulnerable in that sense.
Yeah, and you don't have to now rely on logistics and so on.
It's arguably as vulnerable in the sense of being vulnerable to long distance threats from an ill-governed place. Now, I say that knowing that the Taliban, as of this moment, is believed to have, I've heard the term used, full control. I don't actually believe full, but it's got reasonable control. It's not subject to any active threat.
No, but again, I think when we look at the threat of terrorism, particularly what the United States has experienced, it did not begin with 9/11. I mean, you and I remember
No, of course
that
not.
before 9/11, we had the USS Cole, for instance, on the Clinton watch. And we had other incidents of terror that had been triggered by this kind of fervor, jihadi fervor. And it's not going to end with the US exit from Kabul, meaning it's multi-layered. My broader point was that in terms of policy, considering that every president is on a 4-year treadmill, that you have to be very concerned about the domestic political compulsion. And clearly, having more casualties in a distant place like Afghanistan is not good domestic politics, whatever be the strategic compulsions. So that's my point that, as far as the immediate tactical issue is concerned, the United States does not have to negotiate with the ISI or in turn have US taxpayers' money going to the Taliban to ensure convoy protection. I mean, we've gone through all of that in the past. That's over. But whether or not Afghanistan would become, again, a breeding ground for some of these groups is a question mark. And that's where I think India is also very concerned, because we've had our own experience as far as Afghanistan is concerned. But as a last issue, Ambassador Schaffer, if I could request you to share your thoughts on this, which is that when you look at the next 5 years, maybe, which is a reasonable time. I mean, you've been looking at South Asia in a focused way, as I said, since 1990, if not earlier. But if you were to look at 2025, which is literally 4 years away, and we are talking of the end of this particular cycle, how do you see the US-China-India relationship unfolding to the extent that you can make, an assessment? Desi?
Yeah. I think, first of all, let me say a couple of words about the Quad. The Quad got its start in the wake of the tsunami. And side by side with that was a humanitarian relief effort in which naval forces from the United States and India participated. That was an important moment.
Absolutely.
Excuse me. I think this Quad meeting and the communique that it released was very revealing. Almost everything in the communique was economic, but this was all economic issues that are actually central to national security.
True.
So I think that is the spot that they're trying to reach. If they do even one or two of the things that were in that very ambitious document, they will come to be taken more seriously. And as you know from another meeting in which we both participated, the Chinese are really upset about the Quad.
Sure.
Out of all proportion to what it has actually done so far. So they are really bothered by group, and they didn't mention the word China.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Interestingly, the only time China comes up in that document, it's 2,175 words. I counted them. I saw that. China comes once where it refers to the South China Seas.
yes,
That's the only time that the word China comes. Even I found that very instructive.
That is very interesting. But one thing I noticed was in the early part where it was more philosophical, there was a reference to human rights and prosperity and so on that was in language that for Indians and Americans and Australians and probably Japanese is very familiar language.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that the Chinese would read that and say, yes, they're trying to cram their version of human rights down our throats and we won't have it.
No, you're absolutely right.
So that was one of the telltale signs I thought that the Chinese were not altogether wrong in saying that they were being targeted.
Yeah, yeah. But, apart from the Quad, I just want to add two other points for you to consider, and we'll, end the chat here. One is that in terms of the joint statement of the Quad, they also was, I thought, very valuable reference and an important policy reference to COVID and climate change,
Mhm.
where I thought there was a need for some consensus, not that either problem can be managed in a hurry. And the second, I'm just sharing this and adding this to what you already said. I think China's anger, China's deep concern was also, I think, in a way aggravated by the announcement about AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US cooperation on nuclear submarines. But that really is the subject, I think, for a longer chat. And I hope that we can invite you again, Tezi, because that
I'd be
needs, I think, a
delighted.
lot of chat. But I want to thank you because you have helped us, I think, to unpack, some very complex issues. And I think I'm going to leave this on the table for you to perhaps, give us the chance to chat again. One about this triangle, US, China, and India over the next 5 or 6 years, and the long-term implications of AUKUS, because as you said, we've been discussing this in another forum. But this sounds like a threat that we're going to request you again, Tezi, to join us in this chat, and we can keep this going.
Well, that would be a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for watching SAM Conversations. We'll be back soon. And here's a promise. Ambassador Teresita Schaffer will be back with us before 2021 is over. How's that, Tezi?
Okay.
Cheers. Bye-bye.